a little bit.
Okay, and we are live. Welcome to the 21st live stream of the Music Hack Space. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, glad to be here.
Well, thank you so much for coming. We also have a ghost, which was our way to solve the audio issue here, which was to share audio from Andrew's laptop in the presentation, so we could have some sound. So we will have these ghosts for part of the presentation. So Andrew is American, but has been living in the UK for perhaps 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And is a reader in music technology at Queen Mary University here in London.
Mm-hmm.
And he has invented a few things that were quite influential, especially in the community of the music hack space. So the first time I encountered your work was with the Magnetic Resonator piano, which I'm sure you're going to talk about. It's fantastic augmentation of the piano to make it resonate. And then you went on to extract some of the technology you built for this to create touch keys. And more recently, you created Bela, which is this low latency board that is very popular. And you had many Kickstarters, and they were all very successful. So you're both an entrepreneur and an academic as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, JB. It's been, I think we've worked together for quite a number of years now at this point, since very shortly after I came to the UK in 2011. And, at the time I was working on some of those augmented piano projects, as you talked about. And I've been working at Queen Mary this whole time and working with a fantastic team of people to create all sorts of new instruments and technologies for creating new instruments. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and work is ongoing, and yeah, happy to share a few things that have been going on around the lab.
Well, this is great. So you have prepared some presentation that we're going to go through. I think your laptop, however, your other laptop has gone.
Has it gone? Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Nothing ever works correctly, does it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, apologies, everyone.
All right. Yep. Nothing.
Today, but it will be sorted soon.
We will restart this. Here we go. Do that and enter our broadcast studio. Sorry for this. You'd think that if anyone could work out technology for live streaming, it would be guests on the Music Hack Space, but it's been a surprising set of issues. So here we are. I'm going to share my screen.
Well, maybe one day I will do a special live stream dedicated to sorting audio for live streaming.
Right.
And if you're watching this and are interested to participate and learn your skills, please don't hesitate to contact me.
All right, let's see if this comes up now.
Right.
All right. Well, I have a few videos to share at the beginning of this presentation, but for a lot of it, I won't necessarily need to share computer sound. So if this goes haywire again, we can always just switch over to one machine. Anyway, shall I kick it off? Okay. JB, I don't hear you now, so I hope.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was on mute. So I'm going to remove myself from the stream and leave it to you. And if you're watching this, you're most welcome to ask questions in the chat. We are seeing them. And we can post them like this, so you can, so everyone can follow what's happening. And Andrew will. Would you prefer to answer questions as they come, or wait for the end?
I'm happy to answer questions as I come if I notice it, and so I've got the chat window up here, so I will try to answer questions as they come, but also happy at the end.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Over to you.
Okay, brilliant then. So well, again, thanks so much, JB, for having me here. And I will be talking today about a number of different projects that I'm working on in the lab that I run at Queen Mary, which is called the Augmented Instruments Laboratory. This is a team of PhD students, postdocs, and myself. We've been going since 2011 when I joined Queen Mary. And really just a fantastic group of people who bring a lot of creative ideas and skills to the table. And we've just been working through a number of different projects organized around the general theme of new musical instruments, augmented instruments, which extend the capabilities of traditional musical instruments, and technologies for creating interactive systems. I'm going to tell you at the beginning of this talk, I'm just going to briefly show a few videos of some of the things that I've done recently. And then I'm going to get into maybe a broader discussion about kind of the values and the reasons behind making musical instruments, which I hope will be something of fairly universal interest. So without further ado, one of the projects that got me started on this was an instrument called the Magnetic Resonator piano. This is an acoustic piano which has inside of it electromagnets to manipulate the screen, to manipulate the strings of the instrument. And it can create crescendos, pitch bends, harmonics, different timbres, all acoustically from the piano strings without external speakers. So I'll show you a quick video of this. Oops, sounds like the audio's dropped out for me. All right, so that's the first of the projects. I know there's probably a couple glitches on that video. Happy to post some links to YouTube at the end of it. Another project that I worked on shortly after the Magnetic Resonator piano, as JB mentioned, is called Touch Keys. This is an interface which adds capacitive touch sensing to the surface of the piano keyboard, which lets you control your MIDI instruments in different ways just by kind of intuitive, easy to learn finger gestures. So here's some little demos of that. Hopefully this video will cooperate enough to get the idea. And one thing that I would note about Touch Keys is we did a Kickstarter campaign on this in 2013, and that was successful and subsequently spun out a company to make and sell the kits. We've been out of stock of kits for a while because basically there have been other projects on the front burner for the moment, but we're coming back around to another production run of Touch Keys kits. So touchkeys.co.uk is the place to go for more information about this project. There's some better videos there to check out as well. And if you're interested in the production run, just drop me a line at info@touchkeys.co.uk. So that's another project. Last project I'll talk about briefly. This is a project that was created by a couple collaborators in the lab, Fabio Moriale, who's a postdoc at the time, now located in Auckland, University of Auckland in New Zealand, and Andrea Guidi, who is a PhD student in the lab. The project is called MagPick. It's described in this paper at the NIME conference from last year, and it's essentially an augmented guitar pick that lets you manipulate the sound of the guitar in various ways by interacting with the magnetic fields that are located around the pickups. So with apologies again for the stuttery streaming, let's see if we can hear a few seconds of this. All right. Well, you've hopefully at least heard a bit of that performance by one of the participants in the study. The volume modulation is something that's being done live in real time based on the MagPick. This is an instrument that's based on Bela, and that, in fact, is what I'm going to talk about very briefly now before getting into the bigger picture. So Bela is a platform that we created at Queen Mary around 2013-14 through a project called Hackable Instruments, which was actually a collaboration with the Music Hackspace. So we kind of come full circle. What we are doing with Bela is it is essentially an embedded computer which is designed for specifically for ultra low latency audio and sensor processing. So it's essentially the platform that we always wanted for building musical instruments, something that makes it really easy to process audio and sensor signals in a really detailed and nuanced way, combining the sort of connectivity of something like an Arduino board with the power of a single board computer. As part of this project, we also developed a new approach to high bandwidth sensor processing. So if you have FSRs, let's say, or accelerometers or other kinds of sensors, then instead of just sampling them, a couple thousand times per second at 10-bit resolution, you actually treat each of these analog signals as if it's another audio signal. So you can do really detailed things with the signals that come back from your sensors. And what we found is that this really low latency, really high detail level of sensor processing makes just really nuanced, responsive instruments. Finally, Bela is an open source platform. It's open source hardware, open source software, and it's we've been targeting a kind of musical and maker community, very much the kind of community that Music Hackspace attracts. And so we have a number of different resources, which I'll talk about in a moment. The Bela hardware is based on the BeagleBone Black single board computer. BeagleBone is also an open source platform, which is awfully nice. And it adds to this different analog inputs and analog outputs, audio in and audio out. It seems like my screen has fallen behind my talk now. It's maybe another connection problem. There we go. Here is the Bela Mini, which has a 8 analog input, stereo audio input and output, and various digital I/O. I'll go back one slide to the previous one, and you can see the original Bela board. We released Bela on Kickstarter in 2016. Again, that was a successful campaign, and we spun out a company from there, and we're still doing things with the community. And yeah, stay tuned, Bela.io. There's lots of exciting things still to come there. This is just a little bit about the kind of technical foundations behind Bela. We're using a real-time extension to the Linux kernel called Xenomai, which lets you achieve your audio code running at near bare metal priority on the hardware. And the advantage of all of this is that you can use extremely small buffer sizes and therefore very low latency, which is really pretty useful. Bela also has a built-in browser-based IDE, which is useful for developing code on the platform. The IDE has in it an oscilloscope, which you can use to visualize your signals. So there's the scope. Here's the IDE. You just call it up in your browser. You don't need to install any special software. And it supports a number of different programming languages, ranging from C, C++ through to PD, SuperCollider, C-Sound, etc. We are actually, one thing I want to highlight here, the last thing really before going on, is that we're running I'm making a course on YouTube, which is free, on C++ real-time audio programming. So we're up to about the 12th lecture of this by now. And the you can find it there on our Bela YouTube channel, and it takes you through kind of all the things you need to know from first principles upward about writing real-time code in C++ on Bela. So yeah, spread the word if you're interested. Okay, so let's see, where does that leave us then? Yeah, so other resources for Bela, we're trying to make this really friendly and approachable. So we have a knowledge base with a lot of documentation. We have a forum where you can get various forms of direct support. We have a blog which features a lot of projects that are made on Bela. And yeah, let's see. Just hopefully the screen will catch up with me again here. And yeah, All right. Anyway, I think what I'm going to do now at this point, just because I noticed that this other machine is not doing a hugely great job of keeping up with my talk, I'm just going to try to share the screen from this main machine, and then if that works, then we'll go onward. JB, is that all right?
Yes, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
And if there's any video that I can find for you on YouTube and play, let me know.
Yeah, no, I don't think we necessarily need any video at the moment, really. Let's just see if we can do this. Okay, so there we are. There's a screen share. Main thing here then is, do we have, can you see this?
Yep.
Okay.
It's much more responsive now than it was.
Great. Okay, great. I knew there's a reason that I gave Apple a bunch of money for a new laptop. Okay, let's wait for this to load up. Okay, well, at the moment so can you see my screen at this point?
It's still stuck on the first slide.
Yeah, I think that's right. But do you see my question for you?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
The question being why?
Yes, indeed. So this is the big question, and just jump in at any point if for some reason it seems like the screen stops working. But hopefully it'll be a lot better now that we have a better machine running this. Right. This is, I think, the question that a lot of digital musical instrument designers will face, certainly in an academic context, but really in general. It's like, don't we have enough musical instruments in the world? And what is the reason that we would want to create a bunch of new instruments? And I try to motivate my work in a few different ways. One of them is, of course, we make instruments because we want to make music, right? So this is really the fundamental reason to do these sorts of things. But there's also a good reason to make musical instruments as a way of studying how people interact with technology. So this is more of a research motivation, but by making instruments, we can actually learn some pretty interesting things about the relationship between humans and technology. And then finally, making something that makes noise is not difficult, but making a really good musical instrument that somebody wants to spend years of their life perfecting and playing, that's really hard, actually, from a technology point of view. And I really like this quote from Bill Buxton, who is a pioneer of human-computer interaction, saying that you have your 3 levels of design. You have your standard spec, your military spec, and your artist spec. And that the third of these is the hardest and the most important. But if you can nail that, then everything else is easy. Not suggesting, of course, that we make musical instruments in order to advance military ends, but just suffice to say that it's a very challenging topic. So anyway, we have our arts motivation, we have our HCI motivation, and we have our engineering motivation. Okay, fine, good enough. But still, do we really actually need more musical instruments? Sergei Jorda is one of the leading figures in the new instrument space, and he said back in 2004, many new instruments are being invented, and too little striking music is being made with them. And I think, here we are more than 15 years later, and I think, if anything, this situation has only accelerated. There are so many new musical instruments that are being made every year, and it's really outpacing our ability to really put them to detailed musical ends. So what I want to talk about in this talk is really the values behind the musical instruments. Not so much, how do we program something or how do we attach some sensors together, but what are we really doing and why? What are our aesthetic values, and what values are we inheriting from the technology that we're using? And the place I'm going to start with that is this group of 30 different instruments. Now, do you have any idea, I guess, I'll put this out to the audience, what unifies these 30 instruments? What do they all have in common? They're new instruments, all of them. They come from someplace or other. And they all arise from a very particular set of websites, which most people are familiar with, which is, in this case, Kickstarter or Indiegogo. So these are crowd-funded musical instruments. And we looked at, along with a couple collaborators, we looked at instruments that had been successfully crowd-funded in the last few years. And we just tried to analyze a little bit about what kinds of instruments were being made and what were being said about them. Now, there were a few kind of common themes that would come up in terms of what the creators would say about their instruments. And one of the most common ones was basically that they would advertise themselves as being able to make any sound you could imagine. So you'd get things like this: an intuitive way to create music and play any sound, perform using any sound you could imagine, make music anywhere with any sound. This was very, very, very common. Now, these instruments highlighted here also have something else in common, which is to say that all of these are MIDI controllers, which means that actually, strictly speaking, they're not really making any sound at all. They're making whatever sounds you already happen to have. But nonetheless, that was a very common trope on Kickstarter. We also have here, these instruments had in common, a lot of them would basically advertise their accessibility to novices. Things like, no experience needed, just pick it up and play. Anyone can play it, play quickly and easily. And there's a whole bunch of tropes that come up over and over again. And I thought this was kind of interesting, because especially this latter one about making music or making an instrument so that anyone can play music, because it's really pitched, I think, oftentimes as something that technology just now has made available. But in actual fact, it's quite a historical sort of goal. So we could talk about the Suzuki Omnichord, for instance, in 1981 as being an accessible digital musical instrument. The Omnichord itself models after the autoharp, which goes back more than a century ago. And even the hurdy-gurdy from the Middle Ages is an instrument that was designed to be something that anyone could make music with. So what we often think of as being something that really is new to digital technology is actually just a sort of a value that's been with us for time immemorial. And one thing that I think is interesting about these Kickstarter instruments that really got me thinking is when they talk about anyone can make music, what do we mean by music? And whose music are we talking about exactly? And so, this idea that we can make music, this is not just a monolithic entity. And we want to know kind of in what context might a designer expect an instrument to be played, and what aesthetic ideas might the instrument suggest to the performer. So there's this very nice quote from Thor Magnusson in 2009 about the values implicit in musical instruments. He says, "The piano keyboard tells us that microtonality is of little importance. The drum sequencer tells us that 4/4 rhythms and semiquavers are more natural than other types. The digital audio workstation tells us that it's perfectly normal to repeat the same short performance over and over again in the same track." And I think it's really just useful to remember, I think, that the tools that we use, they are not neutral. They have values encoded in them, whether they are old acoustic instruments or new digital technologies. And that's the kind of thing that I want to unpack in this talk. So, all right, there's one other kind of, I'll go back here, going back to the Kickstarter instruments then for a second. These are all the instruments that are MIDI controllers. And I assume that probably MIDI is the last thing that I really need to explain to everyone here. But in actual fact, it's also worth kind of worth stepping back and remembering what MIDI was created for, and kind of why was MIDI designed, what was it for, and therefore what are the values that are implicit in MIDI these days. Now, this is where I would show you this really lovely video from BBC in 1985 explaining MIDI keyboards, but because we're having sound problems, I think I'll spare you this, and we'll put the link up to YouTube. But it's lovely. Let's see here. What we're going to do instead is what I want to say about MIDI basically is that MIDI was created in 1983 by it was a consortium of manufacturers coming together as the MIDI Manufacturers Association. And their goal was essentially to make different keyboards and synths talk to one another using a standardized language. And that's a laudable goal, and really important one, and it's done a tremendous amount for music. But a lot of the tropes of MIDI are the tropes of the keyboard, and it's very easy, I think, sometimes to forget about that when we use it. The idea that that notes are organized in semitones, you have a series of integers that describe different note numbers, that notes are defined by a discrete unset with a velocity and then a discrete release. I mean, that makes loads of sense for the keyboard, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for virtually any other type of instrument. And yet so much of commercial digital music in the past 30 years has been trying to essentially shoehorn every kind of sound you could imagine into the constraints that were set up according to what synths and keyboards in 1983 needed to do to talk to one another. And there are a number of efforts to refresh MIDI, like with MIDI 2.0, for example, which expands on, erases many of the limitations of the original protocol, but I think doesn't really fundamentally challenge the values about what MIDI is about. But instead of talking about MIDI this whole time, I want to address what I see as a kind of common design process that will happen in the new instrument space, and I think it's a little bit problematic. It starts out with this idea that we want to make an instrument because we want to make music. And I put music in sort of scare quotes here, because when we talk about making music, usually people are imagining making one particular style of music, but it's may or may not be implicit what that style of music is. So this is somebody's value judgment, of course, totally legitimate that I might want to make one or another style of music. But from there, then what we tend to do as designers, I think, is to think about the music that we want to make. And we try to come up with a series of concepts about that music. What are the attributes of music of this sort? And specifically, what concepts do we have convenient words to describe? We might have, we might have, like, let's say for classical piano music, for example, we might be able to come up with some words that describe it. We could talk about, the pitch, which we could call the note number. Maybe we want to talk about the dynamics, which we describe as velocity. Maybe we're interested in the timing between, between different notes. And what we do is we come up with a series of words to describe the music. And, if we went outside of that context, we say, okay, let's not stop with classical piano music. Maybe we also want to control timbre. We want to control spatial location. Maybe we want to apply audio effects. The point is we come up with this sort of dimension space, which we believe describes the kind of music that we want to make. And what ends up happening then is we kind of we can frame it as, well, making music consists of navigating this dimension space of musical qualities. We could theoretically map any classical piano piece to some sort of navigation of this multidimensional space of pitch and velocity and timing and all that sort of thing, which might be true, sort of. But what happens then is we want to design a musical instrument. What we then do is we go to our toolbox and we say, okay, what kind of sensors do we have? Well, okay, we've got some force sensors, we've got some buttons, we've got an accelerometer. All right, fine. And maybe, okay, we've got some computer music languages. We've got, PDE or Super Collider or Max or whatever. And then what we're going to do is essentially come up with a series of numerical quantities that we can get from our sensors and from our language. Here's a signal from our MyFSR. Here's 3 buttons and some events that they generate. And what we're going to do is we're going to connect the numerical quantities from the sensors to the numerical dimension space that we set up, which described our kind of music. And this is the process that we generally know as mapping. And I guess I propose that this exercise of essentially using sensors to navigate a dimension space of musical concepts is a perfectly reasonable way to make an instrument, but is also a very value-laden way of making instruments as well. And I'm not sure that this is necessarily the approach that will get you to any possible musical output, let's say. And maybe as evidence of that, we can see that there's a lot of kind of common themes, let's say, in building digital musical instruments. People, Tom Igoe wrote about the kind of greatest hits and misses of physical computing, basically the things that everybody does. And one of the things that lots of people do when they start is they build an instrument that's like a theremin, or if it's not literally a theremin, then maybe a kind of XY parameter space. I have a touch screen, it has an X dimension and it has a Y dimension. Well, what kind of musical qualities do I want to control with that? Well, pitch is an obvious musical quality and amplitude is a good musical quality. So there we go. X is pitch, Y is amplitude, and done and dusted. There's an instrument made. It will work, but the tools are very much influencing us and pushing us in these directions. Or if you look at people using touch boards, like the Makey Makey, for instance, the idea of making fruit keyboards is a very popular one. You see this a lot on YouTube and other places. And Emily Dolan writes about this really compellingly, I think, and talks about kind of how the keyboard makes music possible. That the keyboard made the Moog synthesizer accessible in the way that kind of allowed musicians to conceptualize what the instrument did. And in the same way, ordering a series of fruits into a keyboard and thinking of them that way somehow takes it from being random sound objects into something controllable. And this is a lovely essay, this one. It goes beyond just this particular observation, and I'd encourage you to go read it. So, okay, fine. So those are very simple examples, banana pianos and theremins and the like. Maybe we just need more degrees of freedom. Maybe a better instrument is one that lets us control more things. And here I turn to Atau, who I think was also a frequent collaborator of Music Hackspace, who wrote back in 2000 about musical performance practice on sensor-based instruments, and talks about this sort of temptation to create very elaborate instruments that let you control all sorts of multimedia stuff, and essentially the danger of ending up with a kind of theme park one-man band out of this. I think this is really quite a true statement, and so more is not necessarily better in my view of making instruments. But I'm interested in the sort of aesthetic background or the aesthetic values that are encoded into the tools that are telling us some of these things about why we might make instruments like this. So one source of aesthetics, of course, comes from the designers themselves, and I'm going to present to you a handful of different projects that I've done with members of the lab that that explore some of these ideas. So Giacomo is a PhD student in the lab, and he's done a lot of work with a design fiction methodology inspired by Christina Anderson's Magic Machines workshops. And what we did in this particular study is we got people to build simple and completely fictional musical instruments. So it was just like a table full of random pieces, plastic cups and straws and bits of styrofoam and that sort of thing. And the instruction was draw a sound and then build the magic machine that addresses your sound. And what we were interested in is what the musical values were that were implicit in what people created, because there's no real technology here, right? These are not functional instruments. They're imaginary instruments mocked up by bits of plastic and string. But what we can see is that if we look at the kinds of genres that participants were involved in as musicians, then we can start to kind of cluster the instruments that people created into sort of different categories. So, for instance, we could classify the outputs of what people made into what we called a prototype, which is what we imagine people would do, which is a sort of a mock-up of what an instrument that might actually exist. So like, this is a special kind of guitar where you bend it this way and it does this kind of thing. It's not really a guitar, it's a piece of plastic or something, but you're saying, imagine that this is a guitar. So some people built these prototype instruments. Some people built more of an abstract representation where rather than actually being an instrument at all, it was more of a kind of high-level metaphor for musical performance. And then some people, particularly in the experimental backgrounds, would actually build literal functional artifacts, which was totally not the point of the exercise. But they would say, the instrument is this paper plate, and the sound that it makes is literally the sound that I'm going to make with it right now as I scratch this plate. So just to take some examples of this, the antenna lele was an instrument that was created as part of this. A ukulele-like instrument with a bendable neck to shape melodies and harmonies. So this is what we call a prototype. It's not actually an instrument, but it's a stand-in for one. Or this one called Corpo Suono, an organ-inspired instrument with tubes altering the air that can produce complex timbres. And but then here's more of an abstract representation. This is the conductor and orchestra. So you see that the sort of spoon and straw represents the conductor interacting with the orchestral musician in the very back row. So it's a kind of, I don't know, something that's a metaphor for performance without being an instrument as such. And then we also had things like this Stochastico, which was a percussive malleable instrument with many different tools and materials for sound generation. This one, the sound it makes is literally the sound of the cardboard and wood. This made by an improvising experimental musician, notably not a music technologist in this case. So what we found out of this exercise was really two different sets of values. And I think this is maybe one place that separates what we might consider sort of traditional classical style music making from maybe more of the experimental arts, such as we find in Music Hackspace. We can find communication-oriented values, where the instrument is designed to be a transparent mediator of the performance intention. The idea is that the instrument might allow us some sort of expression or virtuosity, however we might define that. By contrast, we could see what Tom Mudd calls material-oriented values, where the focus is on the instrument as being a kind of creative collaborator and the technology having agency. Exploration is oftentimes valued over control in this sort of way. And of course, we can break these things down in any number of degrees of detail that we want. Here's some quotes, for instance. The elastic bands are the connection between the musician and the audience, versus, on the other hand, let's add something I can't control, and this was the musical motivation. We can slice this very finely. This was circulating around social media a while ago, this comic about different types of noise musicians. I invite you to explore this later on, but if you've been in this space for a while, you recognize the archetypes, and I'll leave it at that. What we also found in this work was, if we took other people online and we showed them photos and short descriptions of the artifacts that were created, people could really guess the backgrounds of the musicians who were creating them. So they could basically guess that, oh, this must have been made by a classical musician, or this was made by an experimental musician. So even without any technology, there's obviously a lot of set of values that people bring to the table. Now, another type, going back to Kickstarter now for a minute, because now I want to talk a little bit more about the sort of values inherent in the technology. There's one type of instrument amongst these 30 that is more common than all the rest of them, and maybe you can see which one it is. Have a look. Hint. It's the guitar, of course. There's a lot of very successful crowd-funded digital guitars on Kickstarter. And some of the work that we did in the lab, this was Jacob Harrison and Robert Jack, Fabio Morreale, we wanted to know what was the most important factor for a digital guitar to be accepted as a guitar-like instrument. Specifically, are we interested in the interaction modality, i.e. the sensory motor process of playing the instrument, or are we interested in its physical form? Maybe it's more important that something is shaped like a guitar, or looks like a guitar, or lets us kind of choreograph our performance in a way that suggests guitariness. I had another video which I would have shown you, which is essentially asking you to consider what which is the most guitar-like of these four performances, but alas, it's not going to play correctly. So I think we're going to skip over that one and go to the next slide. What we did in this summary, what we did in this particular project was Jacob and Robbie built this instrument called Strummy. Strummy is a simplified guitar-like digital musical instrument, where what we were interested in is kind of separating the difference between the interaction modality and the cultural form of the instrument. And we were taking as our aesthetic context chordal folk music accompaniment. Essentially, what we did is we built 4 different variations of this instrument along 2 different axes. One design variation is that 2 of the instruments had a guitar-like body, and 2 of the instruments were in a tabletop format. Now, and then on the other hand, 2 of the instruments had actual little short lengths of string with piezo sensors to trigger the sounds, and the other 2 instruments had a touch sensor to do the same thing. So each of these instruments produced the same kind of sound, ultimately. But there's different control interfaces and there's different shapes, and we're interested in basically what people's experience of them is. And so what we did is we essentially recruited 32 participants, 16 people identified as guitarists, 16 identified as non-musicians, i.e. they don't play any instrument. And then we gave them an activity in which they got one or another pair of instruments. So some participants would get what was called a congruent pair, which would be the guitar with strings and the touch sensor tabletop instrument. And the other participants would get the incongruent pair, which was the guitar-like body with a touch sensor or the tabletop instrument with strings. And that was really the one we were particularly interested in, that dichotomy. We asked them to improvise, to accompany a simple folk tune, and then to fill out some questionnaires about it. And I'm not going to show you a video of it. darn. But I can at least show you the what the things look like, even though you probably won't hear my sound. So here's the string instrument on the tabletop. And there's the touch tabletop instrument. Okay. And we asked our participants basically which instrument was the most similar to a guitar. And of course, people with a congruent pair were very clear. The string guitar is a lot more similar to a guitar than the touch key tabletop instrument. On the other hand, people who received the incongruent pair really couldn't agree on whether the strings or the guitar-like body made something more similar to a guitar. We also asked them, what instrument would you imagine playing in a folk session? And the incongruent pair, again, there's a lot of disagreement about which of these instruments would be more suitable. And there's one more. Which instrument allowed you to play in the most natural way? Again, clear for the congruent pair, not so much for the incongruent one. So we observed a few things. We observed, first of all, that it wasn't necessarily obviously the case that the macro level form and the micro level interaction were even separable. Like somebody said, well, this is more like a guitar, or this because it has strings, or this looks like a guitar because it has strings, or yeah. So we would get a number of different comments that would suggest these things were not cleanly separable into just shape and interaction mode. There was also a value on the authenticity of experience and the value of what we're calling guitaring, i.e. the kind of cultural and kind of choreographic elements around guitar playing. This participant saying they had the impression of actually doing something similar to playing a guitar. We also asked in this work about whether a greater richness of control produces a better instrument. And my assumption going in was that greater richness of control is always better. Like that's kind of just the value that I know that I come in with. But it wasn't necessarily the way that we expected it to be. What we did in this case is we created two different versions of the action to sound relationship. One of them would have sample triggering, where basically the piezo sensors on the string instrument would just be thresholded, and they'd be used to trigger a playback of an impulse that would go through our string model. The other version of the instrument would use the sound from the piezo as a literal excitation into the physical model of the string. The idea of the second one, therefore, is that it would retain a lot of the nuance of the interaction, like scratching the strings or plucking with the pad of your finger versus the fingernail. You'd get different sounds. Another video that you won't be able to hear, but so I'll just skip that over for now. So we asked people which setting they preferred, and I assumed that everyone would prefer the richer setting. And what we found was that trained guitarists very much did prefer the richer setting, but that non-musicians were very split about which of the two settings they preferred, maybe even leaning toward the lower richness setting. And we would get quotes back saying things like, everything I could do on setting 2 didn't necessarily, or everything I could do worked on setting 2 but didn't necessarily work on setting 1, or setting 2 uses your knowledge of guitar. Whereas the non-musicians would say things like, well, the simpler setting was nice to play because you don't have to pay attention to how hard you strum, or it's easier to get good sounds. So I guess what we took out of this is there is a relationship between expertise and what David Wessel memorably called control intimacy, and that essentially if the more expert somebody seems to be on an instrument, maybe the more they really value these degrees of nuance, but they're prepared to put in the greater effort to really make use of it. Whereas sample triggering at least offers a very easy way of transferring action to sound. A possible future direction for this is to have instruments that tailor their richness to the experience level of the performer. And this is not a new idea. It's been around for some time, but this is something that Laurel Pardue, alum of my lab, has explored, and she calls it complexity management, or the transient simplification of an eventually complex instrument to optimize the learning reward cycle. Laurel's built this instrument called the Svampolin, which has been published at NIME last year, and more. It was at the Guthman competition this year as well. This is a sort of hybrid acoustic electronic violin where it has an electric violin with pickups on each string, a Bela board in the middle to do some digital transformation of the sound, and then it's actually played back through transducers on a violin body. The difference being that the strings and the body are not otherwise acoustically coupled to one another. So it lets you retain the sort of locality and tactile feedback of an acoustic performance, but also while being able to modify the sound between those. So that's a paper you can check out if you're interested in that sort of thing. So there's the electric violin, there's the body, and sound transformation. Okay, back to this quote by Thor about how the piano keyboard tells us certain things, the drum sequencer tells us other things, the digital audio workstation tells us things about what music should be. For a music hackspace community, I think a lot of us are really interested in building new instruments with technology, with maker technology, with different kinds of sensors. And I wanted to ask, essentially, even the simplest sensors, the force sensing resistor, the accelerometer, what do these objects tell us about music? Because I would propose that these are not neutral arbiters of our musical ideas, but that these sensors themselves, even the simplest ones, carry very strong messages about what musical performance really means. The same thing with the programming languages that we use, like Max MSP, for instance. These languages carry values, and this is something that I looked at with a collaborator, Koray Tahiroglu. We wrote a paper in Organized Sound. Actually, it's now published, and you can find it on our website. Basically, positing that it's possible that different computer music languages each have their own signature sound. That there's a Max sound and a Super Collider sound and a C sound, and it's not because they implement their oscillators and filters differently, but it's because the languages shape the way we think. And by shaping the way we think, it shapes the kind of music that we make with them, even when we think that we are in control creatively. So here now is a little preview of what I'm going to present at this year's NIME conference. This is also work with Giacomo. We were looking at the PD programming language, which, as many of you will know, originated from Max in 1985, made by Miller Puckett at IRCAM, licensed to Opcode Systems, eventually spun out to Cycling 74. Max is doing great. PD was created sometime later along the line, also has a really robust community, a lot of really fantastic work happening there. It's interesting to look back sometimes, I think, at what's written about these languages earlier on in their development, because I'm not sure necessarily if the reasons that they were created at the time are necessarily the reasons that we still use them, or maybe just our encounters as users of tools are different than those of the designer of the tool. Anyway, I found this quote from Miller really interesting, saying that the design of Max goes to great lengths to avoid imposing a stylistic bias on the musician's output. That basically it shouldn't sound like Max, and it could sound like a computer as long as that's understood not to imply any stylistic tendency. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this, actually. I don't necessarily agree that Max doesn't impose a stylistic bias on the musician's output, or PD for that matter. And actually, to set out with, to try to test this a little bit, Giacomo and I made a compositional game. And in fact, anyone who's on the Music Hackspace mailing list might have gotten a couple emails about this. We were making basically a simple exercise, an hour long, in which pairs of participants would create very simple instruments, and they would use for this PD as a language. That would be running on Bela, and then there would be three sensors of FSR, a potentiometer, and a button, which would, and they would have to basically use one of these sensors to make just a very, very simple instrument. So the structure of it went like this. We had two participants. They would be at a table. Each of them had their own kit across from one another. They'd make an instrument in 10 minutes that used only one sensor. That was the guideline. Then after 10 minutes, they would swap places and they would choose a different sensor and they'd make a different one sensor instrument. They'd do the same thing again. Then they'd have a third instrument also with only one sensor. And then at the end, they would integrate those three simple instruments into one slightly more elaborate instrument using all three sensors together. Basically, the structure of this activity was just to keep people on their toes, to keep people from really overthinking, to just do kind of what naturally comes when you encounter this technology. Because what we're interested in here is what are the aesthetic values that PD as a language or these sensors as bits of hardware might encourage you to do as an instrument designer. And I prepared a compendium of some of the instruments that came out of this, which I will now also not be able to show you. And then what I can do is I can summarize it for you, and I'd be happy to point you to the NIME talk when it goes online. NIME, by the way, if anyone is on this stream and is not familiar with NIME, NIME stands for New Interfaces for Musical Expression. This is an academic conference, but not your usual kind of slightly dry thing where people just talk on and on for ages like I'm doing right now. There's a lot of real vibrant community of instrument builders and musicians and engineers, computer scientists coming together to do crazy things with technology. Really inspiring place to be. This year, of course, like everything, NIME has gone online. And the nice thing about that is that the registration is so much cheaper than it would have been if it was an in-person conference. So have a look at that. It's nime.org, nime.org, and you can find more details. The conference takes place in the third week of July. Anyway, so people built all these simple one sensor instruments, and we looked at what they did with them. And what we found was that people used only 3 sound sources. This is across 14 participants, and I think about 24 instruments in total from a couple different steps. All the instruments generated sound either with the OSC object, which is a sine wave, with a phaser, which is a sawtooth, or with white noise. And maybe there's some filtering, there's some modulation and stuff, but the sound always started with one of these 3 sound sources. And we would see some instruments with multiple oscillators in the same patch, but nobody used sampled sounds, nobody used wavetables, nobody used any other kind of sound sources in this exercise. And I thought that was kind of interesting. We also looked at how people use the controls of their instrument. We found that people who made an instrument with the potentiometer, 7 out of 10 of them used the potentiometer to control the frequency of an oscillator. A few of them used it for some other things. When people used the FSR, then it was about 50-50 between controlling frequency and controlling amplitude. And when people got a button to work with, the most common thing to do with it was to essentially make it like a keyboard key, where you press it to trigger a sound, like turn on and off an oscillator. Although sometimes we would see fairly frequently, like as a kind of randomized function, you'd click the button and the frequencies would randomize. We also saw that out of 26 instruments, 21 of them used linear mapping or linear scaling from the data that came in from the sensors to the sound parameters that came out. And I think that's really interesting because it's not anything that you could really put at the feet of a kind of musical or perceptual motivation. I mean, we hear both amplitude and frequency on logarithmic scales, and yet people aren't using logarithmic scales, they're using linear scales. And the reason they're probably using linear scales is that is the most natural thing to do with these tools, because it's very easy to write an equation to multiply and add things, and very difficult to work out how the exponential stuff works. The other thing that I thought was interesting about this exercise is we asked the listening preferences of our participants, and what kind of music do they like to listen to, or what kind of music do they like to make. And it was really wide ranging across 14 people. But we don't really see any of the kind of stylistic tropes of a lot of these styles of music. We really see the stylistic tropes of experimental electronic music almost universally. Like, we don't see samples being played back. None of the instruments quantized pitch to a chromatic or even a microtonal scale. We didn't see any rhythmic patterns in these instruments except for a regular metronome, no step sequencers, and nothing that would dynamically instantiate different numbers of voices. And you can't really explain this by saying, okay, this is just people creating the instruments that they want to create. You really can explain it, I think, by saying this is what PD makes it possible and makes it really intuitive and idiomatic for us to do. So basically, yeah, we think that this exercise told us a little bit about the idiomatic patterns and the kind of aesthetic values that might exist in a language like Max or PD. And it doesn't diminish these languages at all. Actually, I think it's really, I think that the set of values that are in there has been incredibly effective for people making music. But it's important to remember that our tools carry these aesthetic scripts. the same issue of Computer Music Journal that Miller Puckett was writing in, also we had David Ziccarelli wrote a very nice article about Macs at the time. And he points out another very important factor, which is that any tools that we use, it's not just about the technology of those tools, it's also about the community that's around them. And I think especially in a forum like this one with Music Hackspace, we learn from one another. We share ideas, we borrow example materials, and that's potentially an important way that we share values with one another at the same time. One other piece of work along these lines that I did. This is something. So this was led by Charlotte Nordman, who's a PhD student in the lab, and we were looking at exploring completely unfamiliar materials, sensors that people wouldn't probably have encountered before, and in the context more of craft practice. So we weren't specifically looking at music in this case. We were more looking at sort of general handcrafted objects that had some sort of sonic interaction and a kind of imagined broader meaning beyond that. There's a paper at the bottom of this slide here, which you can see more details about it there. But basically, we found with this sort of somewhat novel magnetic sensor technology that we put together, that people came up with all sorts of interesting designs using conductive e-textile materials and other conductive and non-conductive materials. And we observed the ways that people's understanding of the material emerged together with the designs that they made. And in this, we also were able to ask some questions about the values that were behind our technology. Okay, right. Okay, so let's kind of bring this around toward a conclusion then. I think what I've learned from a lot of this work over the past few years is a few different principles. One is that the materials are never aesthetically neutral. Every tool and every material has its idiomatic patterns. There are certain ideas that are going to be easier or more obvious for designers and certain ones that are going to be harder. And the things that are easier to do will oftentimes be the things that are disproportionately appearing in the output. It's neither good nor bad, but it's not neutral, to paraphrase Kranzberg. And the other thing is that there really is no such thing as a generic musical instrument. So if we're going into digital musical instrument design saying that we want to make an instrument for people to be able to make music, I think it's really important that the next step is to specify what that means. What kind of aesthetic assumptions are we talking about? What style of music? What are the culture? What is our cultural background? What is the cultural context in which we expect it to be used? And because these are going to appear in the design whether we're aware of it or not at the beginning. And then I think the third thing is that designing instruments is not a kind of act of, kind of asserting creative dominance over the musical world, let's say. Design is an exploration. No matter how clear your objective might be in mind, ultimately, we're all going to be influenced by the tools that we're using. And the tools are going to suggest things to us. And we oftentimes kind of put these things together in a process of bricolage as a way of exploring the patterns of sort of the available creative opportunities that we see in front of us. And this is a good thing. I think this is, I think that a lot of interesting principles come out of this. Okay, so in that context, I'm going to come full circle then back to the Magnetic Resonator piano. This is really the first digital instrument that I made. I talked about it briefly at the beginning. And I want to talk about my values and my process of kind of why I made this instrument. Now, I've given this talk on this instrument quite a number of times, and some people on this call may have even heard this talk before. That supposedly the reason for the MRP to exist is because the piano is a discrete instrument which doesn't let you continuously shape the sound of the notes, and therefore, by building an electronic augmentation of the piano, we could add a kind of continuous control to this acoustic instrument. All well and good, but honestly, it's not true. That's not why I did it. That's a good back justification for why I made this instrument. But actually, to really think about why did I make this particular instrument at the time I made it, well, it's here. I was doing a PhD in music composition at UPenn at the time, and up until 2009, I had not written any pieces for solo piano of any significance. So I'd written orchestra pieces, string quartets, chamber ensemble, whatnot. I'm a viola player myself, and I'm not really a pianist. And I found it honestly quite terrifying to write solo piano music, because if you don't really physically understand the instrument in a way that a pianist does, how do you know that you can really write something that sits under the fingers? And moreover, what are you supposed to do after generation upon generation of incredible composers writing for the keyboard? It's quite a formidable challenge. And so my idea was that what I would do is I would use the MRP to sort of change what the piano was about just enough that then I would be able to have my own kind of creative inlet and maybe have some original ideas. Not because the piano was deficient in any way, but because I wanted maybe a different inspiration as starting point. So that's why, so basically that was what led to this whole elaborate series of electromagnets and amplifiers and whatnot. And I'm not here to talk about the technology of that tonight, but I will talk a little bit about what subsequently happened, which is that I've worked with a lot of different composers and performers in a number of different genres. And this has been really, really inspiring and interesting. Like this project with These New Puritans happened in 2013 and 14. That was really a lot of fun. It was an album done in the studio, and then a big show at the Barbican with like basically this incredibly elaborate orchestra, including the MRP on stage. A lot of composer commissions. This was a project out of LA a few years back. Used it in things like opera. This is Maria Kaliampa, who wrote a really nice opera involving the MRP in there. Then there have been some other vocal pieces also written for that. It's been used in film scores and a bunch of other things. One of the big projects that's happened recently is Xenia Pestova is a really wonderful keyboardist extraordinaire who plays all sorts of different keyboards, including the MRP, and she's been doing a project involving pieces that she has written for the instrument, and also a piece with the Ligeti Quartet that was released just last year on Diatribe Records, and yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. You can find the link from Xenia's website at the bottom of the screen. And what I thought was interesting about this, and the reason that I bring these things up, is that I've seen a real bifurcation in how people treat the MRP as an instrument. I see one group of composers and performers who treat it as maybe a sort of a piano plus plus. Let's say it's it has the normal affordances and capabilities of the piano, but it also has a lot more. These the continuous note shaping, harmonics, pitch bends, whatever. The other group of people who encounter the instrument basically see it as something completely different from the piano at all. And they say, well, you know what, maybe I don't even want the hammers to ever hit the strings. I only want to have this resonant box that, lets me make all of these really unusual sounds. And my experience brought to mind this quote from Thor Magnusson's recent book, Sonic Writing, which I highly recommend, by the way. And it's basically the way that we notate sound, the way that we transcribe things, is a process of selective abstraction and classification. And the basic idea is that the way that we choose to write things down affects the way we think, and the way we think affects the way we hear. So the idea is that almost by writing something in Western staff notation, you're already deciding what the important things are and what the not important things are, and that's going to change the way you think about music. And so I think I've seen, for instance, quite a different approach to the MRP from people who start with a notated composition and then have that played, versus something like Xenia's piece, for instance, which is mostly a kind of structured improvisation within certain sort of regular categories. And this maybe brings me back to the very beginning about why do we make musical instruments? Well, we make music, of course, but we also do this because we learn something about the way that we engage with technology creatively and the way that we think, just by kind of observing what comes out of them. And it's been really quite an interesting few years. So final principle then is that whatever instruments we build, people will interpret them completely differently than what we think they're about anyway. Circuit bending is a wonderful example of this principle in action taken to an extreme, but we should welcome this kind of an engagement with other people's values and other people's priorities. So I guess what I'm proposing then is that we don't build digital musical instruments or any musical instruments because there's a problem to be solved. There are enough instruments in the world, and there's lots of really great ones, and there's a lot of really great music being made with old instruments and new instruments. The reason that we make instruments is it's for the same reason that we do performances and compositions. We're engaging in some kind of ongoing artistic conversation. And in some cases, by creating instruments that are continue to be performed, or by creating tools like Max and PD that people use, that conversation can actually extend out years or even decades into the future. And I think that's why this is just such a fun area to be involved in. So I'll stop there. This is a few projects from my lab. Again, the URL for this is instrumentslab.org. You can find some of these papers there, some videos that will actually play properly, and a few other bits of description. So thanks very much, and maybe we should have some discussion.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this, Andrew. A very, very interesting and rich talk with a lot of references, a lot to think about. I think someone made a comment which resonated with me, that they didn't have a question as such, but a lot of things to mull over from what you just said. One question that is coming from me, just to get the conversation started, is instrument designers will probably not go to the same length as you and your lab did to analyze the affordances and the thought, mechanical or sensor base that go into an instrument, but their approach that would be different. Have you considered teaming up with people who design instrument to see how just to confront these two things together? And another question I have for you is, for the people who watch this and get inspired by what you're doing, how would you what would you recommend them to get started designing their own instruments? So two questions.
Good. Yeah. Okay. Those are interesting questions. So in the first case, I mean, I guess is a question about teaming up with maybe more commercial instrument makers as opposed to something in the kind of academic sphere or just other individual creators. I think it's always really interesting to learn from other instrument creators, actually. And I've learned a ton of things, and we can trace back some of the lineage of some of the things that I've done to other instruments. The MRP, I was far from the first person to put magnets into piano strings. Per Bloland and Edgar Berdahl did some really nice work with the piano, although actually I wasn't aware of most of it until I was nearly done. There's other instruments like the strummy instruments that I showed were partly inspired by some of the kind of physical modeling synthesis that was coming out of Karma a few years back, and I think we all kind of pitch in these ideas and share them around, and I think that's good. Actually, I think it's really good when people can learn from other instruments being made, as opposed to everybody thinking that they have to build something from first principles every single time. And this is why I like NIME as a community, but it's not limited to academic communities, of course. YouTube is a tremendous resource, and then there's a lot of exciting stuff out in the commercial world as well. The second question, where do people start? Where would I suggest starting building your own instruments? I guess, I don't know if there's one good answer to that, but I think I would not start with the technology, is what I would say. Don't necessarily assume that if only you have the right toolkit or the right programming language that you're off to the races in terms of making music. I think it's much more that you need to have some idea of what it is that you're trying to do, or if you're exploring, then just to look for something very simple, like some very interesting, just find an interesting phenomenon and then see how you can develop it. And some work that I did a while ago with Victor Zappi, also with Music Hackspace, we made this sort of ridiculously simple one-button instrument that made this kind of squawk sound, just as a way of exploring how people creatively misuse technology. And that in turn was inspired by some other work by Michael Gurevich and Paul Stapleton in a few years earlier. But yeah, I think don't imagine starting with something really elaborate. If you can make something that just goes beep, actually spend a while just going beep and see what interesting stuff there is to learn there, and then expand bit by bit. And I guess I don't know if there's a general answer except listen carefully and ask yourself hard questions.
All right. Well, maybe we'll have a workshop one day with you to get people started. At least having the technology as technology can be a solved problem very easily when you get the right information. So
Yeah.
there is a question from 14-bit MIDI, which
Okay.
I'm going to bring up to screen, which has to do with the resonator.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Hey. Hi, Paul. Yeah. So yes. By the way, sorry if I missed any questions while I was speaking. I wasn't able to see the chat box while I spoke. But does the resonator create sound on its own? Yes, it does. Or rather, the sound comes from the interaction between the magnets and the strings. So they're not solenoids in the sense of like robotic actuators, where they actually have a little plunger that kind of presses out and strikes an object. Instead, they're electromagnets. So it's just a coil of wire in a little cylindrical case, and it's positioned above the string by maybe 2 millimeters, so that the magnetic field, because the string is made out of steel, the magnetic field will draw the string upward just a tiny bit, and so it'll induce sound into the strings without anything actually having struck it. So if you just had it sitting on your desk, it wouldn't make any sound at all because there's no strings attached to it. But there's no, or at the very least, there's very minimal kind of acoustic byproducts. I do find that the magnets chatter just a little bit at the very high frequencies, and if you run them for too long and they overheat and they get kind of cooked, then they still work, but then they get more chattery, and then so I have to swap out magnets periodically when that when that happens. Yeah, very much like very much the EBO effect, but more controllable from the keyboard.
Okay, so what projects do you currently have that are ongoing for the next few years? What are you going to focus on?
Yeah, well, it's a few different things. Well, I talked about Bela at the beginning, so we have a great team of people working on Bela stuff, and we just released a Kickstarter for this for a set of touch sensors we call Trill. So that's Bela.io/Trill. Basically, they are the sensors that we originally made for another early musical instrument, just basically touch position sensors that you can integrate into projects very easily. So that's been a kind of focused project that we've tried to get out there for makers and instrument designers, and they come in various shapes and sizes. On the research side and on the sort of closer to performance side, I'm really interested in violin family instruments at the moment. And as I said earlier, I'm a viola player, and I haven't really done that much until recently with kind of electronic viola or violin instruments, partially because it's really hard to do it well. I mean, to make a MIDI violin is doable, but is invariably disappointing when you're done, and because it's just not what the violin is about. And but more recently, I've gotten very interested in maybe real-time timbre transformations of instruments. So if we have an instrument with a quadraphonic pickup, let's say, like a viola, where each string has its own pickup, could we in some manner do some kind of real-time signal analysis and resynthesis of something that, the idea being that you could create a fundamentally different sound than the original viola, but that it would still respond to you as a player in a way that was understandable enough that you could use your expertise. So actually, this whole idea of designing for expertise, I think, is really quite central to what I'm interested in right now, which is that, it takes so long to become proficient at a new musical instrument that not many people are really going to do it. So the best thing that you can do is borrow that expertise from another instrument that somebody already knows how to play, but to do that in a way that's not just a kind of trivial modification of the original, not so easy. So yeah, maximize novelty, minimize relearning. That's the big goal. And the violin family is where I hope to next do something. And you would have seen Laurel's work in the slide, so that's been kind of the starting point of it. But it's we'll keep working on it.
Right.
Yeah. Marcel asked about the piano bar. Are we still working on it? Yes, we are. That's been a very long time in the making. This is a paper that I first published in 2013 at NIME, and it's been making its way. Actually, we were getting pretty close to releasing it, and then the pandemic hit, and all the machine shops are closed, and it's been a bit slow going since this time. But what we have, just for to explain, there was a product in the early 2000s called the Moog piano bar, and this is a an optical scanner for the piano keyboard. You just drop it at the back of the keyboard, and it measures the keys and gives you MIDI output. Really, really nice. But it's been discontinued for a lot of years, and I don't think it's coming back. I was very interested, and when I made the Magnetic Resonator piano, I modified my piano bar so that rather than giving me MIDI, I could have continuous key angle, which is really kind of a super rich and interesting data source. Since then, I've been working on a new piano scanner that is not the piano bar. It's designed from the ground up to measure continuous key angle on each of the keys. And it could also produce MIDI from that, but it's sort of natively engineered for a higher res sort of input. And yeah, it is going along. We had a lot of work on it in the last year or two. So Giulio Moro is a recent PhD grad of Queen Mary, and who I co-supervised. And he made some really nice instruments based on continuous key angle data as opposed to MIDI. So his thesis is out there somewhere, where he's got a paper at NIME this year. But yeah, we're still building it, and I'm hoping at some point that'll be a thing that we release out there. And touch keys is happening too. Definitely some some more effort to go into that the coming months. Adrian, absolutely. Yeah, I should. To be clear, it was a boot. The piano bar was like this sort of a really interesting cross-coastal collaboration of synth legends, right? It was Don Buchla designed the thing, and then it was licensed to Moog Music, who sold it for a number of years. It really, it's one of those products that has such an incredible devoted following, but I guess at the time it just wasn't enough of a following to make it a commercial success, which is a shame.
Right. There's a comment as well from the Center for Haptic Audio Interaction Research.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So
yeah, definitely worth checking out the. So I will look forward to that NIME demo. But I put in a good word also for Chair's existing instruments. They have this sort of instrument that integrates touch sensing, like touch position sensing and piezo activation, so that you can kind of tap on it and slide your finger around. It's a really lovely integrated experience, and something I've played with at Superbooth before. So yeah, worth having a look at.
Are any of the NIME demos open to the public online?
I don't know. My guess is that to do any of the NIME stuff, you need to register for NIME. I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like £35 or something like that to register. So I mean, it's like, it's not nothing, but for a week of entertainment, it's not so bad. My guess though is that everybody who has, a lot of the people who are doing NIME videos of any sort are going to put them online afterwards. I know I will.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That led me to another question, and maybe we can wrap up with this,
sure.
Which is, at the Music Hackspace, we want to break down the barriers for accessing knowledge, and a lot of universities, to be honest, are also embarking into that. Like you can get lectures. I mean, your own lectures, they're publicly available. You could follow curriculum from Stanford and Harvard and other very prestigious universities for nearly free. But there is still something, there's still a divide between academia and initiatives like the Music Hackspace. And I think that I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on how to bring together these environments, how to share the resources in a way that gets that recognize the research that people do on their own. And for example, you were a composer, and at some point in your life you have been an electronic engineer and a software engineer as well. And so you've learned by yourself a lot through this process. In your lab, is it possible that someone with no degree but a lot of experience could join and do a PhD with you and your team?
Well, I would certainly love to do that. And I mean, I think, well, first of all, in coming into my lab, we're in an engineering and computer science department, but the people who are in the lab are coming from all sorts of different backgrounds. And so it's not just, you need to have a degree in electrical engineering or you can't join. There are interesting issues, I think, around academia in general, and is new instrument design really an academic field? Is it not an academic field? I mean, it's sort of both, because there's just different sets of incentives. As as academics, we have to, we're expected to publish papers, we're expected to bring in grants, and we're expected to kind of, meet certain metrics that are defined as quality according to a very generic academic sort of thing. And new instrument design fits uncomfortably into those sometimes. And I think we even see that at conferences like NIME, where we can't really decide, are we a scientific conference? Are we an artistic conference? We're kind of all of those things, but how do we make sure that everybody gets tenure who's doing this sort of thing? And I guess it's the same thing with degrees, right? I'm not so interested in degrees for degrees' sake, right? And I think that's true even of the PhD. The point of the PhD should be the work that you do during it, and the kind of things that you learn and the things that you share with people, not that you have the doctor before your name or whatever. And it really ought to be the same thing coming into a degree program like that. It shouldn't be like, oh, you don't have the right pedigree, so no, we won't even talk to you. I mean, in practice, can I say that that every university, or even my own university, is going to be sort of sufficiently game that they would take somebody with a really unconventional background? It's hard to say. I don't know. I mean, I think this is a really important conversation, because the question is, how do people get skills? How do they get experience designing new instruments? How do they share their ideas with other people designing new instruments? And how can we do that within an academic context, but also not in an academic context? And we don't have these kind of two silos of, the people who are doing it as research and the people who are doing it as hobby or as personal artistic practice. Yeah, that's maybe that's a question for others to weigh in on. I think you ask a really good question, but I think Music Hackspace is really well placed to be one of the organizations making those connections.
Well, hopefully, I definitely want to participate to that and help people to access this, and also, I mean, I think there is an interest for you, and that's why we collaborated years ago.
Oh, absolutely.
To reach out to an audience of practitioners who would validate or to participate into research studies.
Yeah. Absolutely. I saw Adrian has a question about cultural traction of academic instruments. I think that's worth talking about, because it does happen occasionally, but maybe not. Maybe the reasons that it happens are kind of telling in themselves. I think, or it depends on what you call academic. Like, I think of The Hands, for instance, by Michel Weiswitz, is an instrument that was his own personal artistic practice, but was situated close enough to what I would consider an academic community, even though he wouldn't have thought of it as an academic instrument. It certainly was something that was much written about, much discussed. And then, he sadly died, and the instrument, was kind of, I guess, not widely played, but I think there's been a renewed interest in revitalizing that instrument and having it played again. I've seen this also with the T-stick. This is made by Joe Malik and Marcella Wanderley's group at McGill. I don't think that ever went kind of out of practice, but it was made in the early 2000s and has been kind of redone a few times. You could probably find other cases of this. I mean, maybe we need to have more music for slabs or something, let's say. But a lot of the time, I think what happens is that an instrument has becomes so iconic for various reasons. Maybe because of the circumstances of its creation, or the particular person who made or played it, or the music that was made with it, that then it sort of becomes obsolete for a time, because people say, oh, well, it's not new anymore, so we're going to move on. And then 10, 20 years later, people say, hey, remember that amazing thing back then? Let's go back and find what that's about and see if we can recreate it. Which is also, I think, what you see happening in the commercial world right now, all these reissues of various classic synths. Could definitely have a whole long discussion just on that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Anyway,
maybe one last question from 14-bit MIDI.
What are the biggest obstacles in creating new instruments? Well, there's one answer is that, technically speaking, there's never an obstacle, right? It's just about thinking about kind of what you're trying to do, and are the values of your technology aligned with your musical values? But that's maybe a bit flippant. So I think resolution and latency, those are my hobby horses at the moment, certainly with Bela. And I think there's a lot of things where you think, oh, we have this sensor and it's measuring this quantity, and then we have this producing sound in some way. And that can be true, but it's a huge experience difference whether you have a relatively infrequent sampling with a lot of jitter and relatively low resolution versus if you have something that is being sampled at tens of kilohertz, passed through with 1 or 2 milliseconds of latency straight through to the sound. It's just about creating a really convincing illusion that sort of the tactile sense and the generated sound are really one and the same. And it's the kind of thing where you don't really notice it if you've got an Arduino board, it's connected to Macs by USB. It works fine, it's all right. But then you try a different approach that doesn't have that kind of bottleneck, and you think, oh wow, where's this been all that time? And so yeah, I think bandwidth of sensing is really, all the technology is there to do it. Like, processors are fast enough, sensors are good enough, ADCs are cheap enough. We've just got to change our tools to prioritize the things that really matter for musical interaction, because it's not necessarily the same things that you want to make a cheap smartphone.
Right, and yeah, maybe a complementary observation to this answer is that making an instrument takes time, and adoption takes generations. It's Gerhard Bela, the CEO of Ableton, had a very interesting a view on this, and which went against, in fact, the funding of startups, doing new instruments, which essentially was saying that you can't pump money into to accelerate that, because musicians are not going to adopt to new instruments in a day. Like they need, it needs a lot of practice. It needs a lot of a repertoire. It needs benchmark pieces, and all of this takes natural organic time. Like there's no acceleration of this. So I suppose a big obstacle is finding people and having the time and having desire to thrive for a number of years before that exists. So it's really, in my opinion, a passion. It has to be a passion and driven by a lot of love for the instrument itself.
Absolutely, yep. And the community, I mean, the presence of a community is just incredibly important, and it doesn't form itself. It requires good instruments to begin with. It requires dedicated practitioners, which isn't necessarily just the creator. It might be the first composers and performers, and there's a lot of randomness, I think, sometimes in which instruments end up persisting and which ones don't. But when you look back at any successful instrument, you see a whole set of circumstances that's about so much more than the technology, and I think that's really important to think about. Yeah.
Indeed. And just one last thought, because on Thursday we will welcome Adrian Fried, and Adrian is the co-inventor of OSC, and it's interesting to see this opposed OSC versus MIDI 1.0 or MIDI 2.0. But yeah, both open perspectives, and not to throw a controversy in here by opposing them. I think they're complementary, but looking forward to having Adrian here and hear more about his fantastic career.
It'll be great. Yeah, and I know that Adrian also has a really nice new instrument out now, so that's worth checking out. So yeah,
indeed, the Fingerphone, and we'll have I hope a demo on Thursday.
Yes, so hopefully his sound works better than mine did. So apologies for the lack of videos. You would think that we would have solved audio routing by now, but.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for this fantastic talk. Thank you, everyone, for following, and please come back on Thursday for Adrian.
Great.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Okay. Bye.